Thank you, Phil. It's just really a joy to be here today. I remember I was about your age, I think. I heard of Dorothy Day for the first time, and a little snippet of what she was about. And then the more and more I got to read her, never met her personally, but I read many of her books and what she did prophetically. He was a prophet of our times. And we were all baptized priest, prophet, and king. And prophet means that you're motivated solely by the Spirit, and that you act on your conscience. Your conscience is formed around the gospel, the teachings of Jesus in the church. And she had the courage to do that in so many ways. So I think you're very privileged to be here tonight. And for Martha Hawk, her granddaughter. Martha is an activist, a mother and a wife. She lived with her family in Vermont, and they lived for generations on a farm, more or less a farm in the beautiful state of Vermont, with her husband and wife and children, and her brothers and sisters live nearby. They are farmers too. And of course, being the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, she was inspired by her work, not as a very young person, but later on in life, she became totally enamored by her and in a sense challenged by her witness, her love. And she spends time in New York City at the Catholic Worker House, their Mary House in New York City. And she'll be telling you about that later on, I'm sure. That was founded by her grandmother, Dorothy Day. Martha has extensively traveled throughout the United States and throughout the world in trouble spots in Afghanistan, in Iraq, where bombs are falling nearby, and meeting with the victims of war. That United States war that is perpetrated by us, by our administration and by our army. She's a life and witness to the Catholic worker, springs from grace, prayer, and prophetic action on behalf of the poor and powerless. She has been a prisoner of conscience in the spirit of Martin Luther King and her grandmother Dorothy Day and others. And a life of witness to the Catholic workers springs from Jesus' gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, which is the heart of the gospel, in which the first Christians lived out for almost 200 years. And they were going against the grain. They lived in an area, in a time, most of you probably know, where militarism was very strong, and where the church was being persecuted. It was persecuted because it proclaimed the gospel by people's lives. When you proclaim the gospel by your life, in a society, much like our own, doesn't welcome it, you pay the price of discipleship, and many of them went to court and went to prison for opposing military service and just for sticking up for the gospel and the Sermon on the Mount. So Martha helps in soup lines, as her grandmother did. She's here today to inspire us and to pray with us in the spirit of her grandmother. I'd like to read something to you about Dorothy Day, her own words that I came across a couple of days ago. It was written by her in one of her memoirs. Dorothy said, "As you come to know the seriousness of the situation, of the times we live in, the war, the racism, the poverty, you come to realize it is not going to be changed by words. It's going to be changed by actions. It's going to be changed by living out your life in drastically different ways. And this is a risky business." And the Spirit tells us, Christ tells us, that faith casts out all fear. And I think that Martha is an example of that. Her fearless witness to the gospel, risking arrest and imprisonment as the first Christians did. So we're honored and blessed to have Martha here today. Thank you, Martha.
Let's get rid of this.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I understand the pressures that students are under these days, so I'm very grateful to have many of you here. I also want to thank Bill and Phil and Sister John for the work that they've done to put this event together, to put all of these discussions together. It's a wonderful program. I hope it's something that can become annual for the 4 colleges in the area. It's always important to start off an endeavor with a prayer, And this is actually a poem, and it's written by Father Daniel Berrigan, who is a native of Syracuse, New York. And his poetry, to me, is a form of prayer. This poem is called Some. Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for being taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth, they walked the waters, they walked the air. Why do you stand, they were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, and because of the bread. Because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. Daniel Berrigan. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I was born in Staten Island near the Peter Marn Catholic Worker Farm in 1955. My older sister Mary was born there on the farm with a midwife, and then the next 3 of us children were born there. I'm number 7 of 9 children. My parents moved the family to Vermont in 1957 when I was 2 years old, and I have had the most wonderful privilege of remaining on that land for my entire life. And my brother raised his family on the half of the property where the original farmhouse stood, and my husband and I built a house across the field, and we raised our kids there. We do a lot of gardening. My mother was a gardener. She was a true disciple of Peter Marn, who was a peasant, who was a man of the soil. She learned from him at the Easton, Pennsylvania farm, the first farm that was opened by the Catholic worker movement in 1936. And so I'm very grateful to have the family and the soil and the history that I have. We have 30-year-old fruit trees and grapevines that we planted, and this year it was a bumper crop for apples and pears and grapes. So we're very grateful for the bounty of the land. I'm also retired from the field of occupational therapy, and I'm ever grateful to have had that career. I worked with children with learning differences in the public schools for many years. I also worked with the elderly in geriatric rehab, and I feel that just about every important decision that I've made in my life has very much been influenced by Dorothy's presence. Her hand has been behind my back for most of my life, and it took me a very long time to respond to that in terms of participating in the Catholic Church and in the Catholic worker. But I had a great time spending 30 years on the farm raising a family. So now I've been pushed out into the world, and I'm here to share these stories with you. I know that people like to hear personal stories about Dorothy, and she was a very large presence in our lives. She very frequently visited my mother and her grandchildren as much as she could with the heavy workload that she had. And we also, as kids, went down to the Catholic Worker Farm, which was located in the 1960s and 70s at the Tivoli Farm, which was on the Hudson River. And so we saw quite a bit of Granny. And I was 25 years old when she died, and I had had my first child in 1977. So she got to meet one of her great-grandchildren. We met her in the city, Mary House. We visited her. I think it was 1979, the year before she died. And my son, as a 2-year-old, was very, very active. And Granny became very quickly fatigued with this child tearing around her room. So she said, "Please, take him away. This is too much." And that was kind of my last memory of my time with her. She was failing her last year because of her heart condition. She had congestive heart failure. But we had many wonderful visits from her in Vermont. And I think one of the most vivid memories I have of her, it's very funny. The memory is a funny thing. And we were wild teenagers. It was the late 60s, early 70s, and Dorothy had to put up with a lot with 9 grandkids running wild out in the woods of Vermont. And I remember one day turning up the record player really loud and putting on this music, heavy metal, horrible stuff. And she looks at me and says, "What is that?" And I said, Black Sabbath. And she looked at me and said something to the effect of, "Yeah, I figured it was something like that." And she was just appalled. So that's certainly a memory that has stuck with me, with Granny. But another memory I have of her is visiting her. I have a sister, Mary, and Mary was 20, I was 16. We were visiting St. Joe's house on First Street, that was purchased in the mid-60s. Mary House on 3rd Street was purchased in the mid-70s, and that's where Dorothy lived and died. The last 5 years of her life she was at Mary House. But my sister and I were visiting her at St. Joe's, and she was always putting us to work. She was very practical. And we were busy sweeping the floor, and I am very much of a Martha, I have to admit. And Dorothy said to me, "Martha, you need to be more like Mary." And as a 16-year-old, I was very crushed by that. I felt like I had disappointed her somehow. But she was very right. My sister was more of a contemplative, and I was much more of an active child. And Dorothy also, when I was, I think, maybe 10 years old or 12 years old, my mother was receiving training as an LPN to go to work to support her 9 children without a husband. And she spent 4 months with us, which was quite a chunk out of her schedule while my mother was in nurses training. And my mother was very permissive, and my grandmother was not. She was very much focused, very much understanding what needed to get done, and we were made to do the dishes. So that's another grand memory that I have of her, being forced to do the dishes, which is something my mother never did. So she was very much a gentle, kind, non-judgmental kind of a person. My older siblings maybe had a different experience of her than I did, as she was getting more worn down and tired by the time I was older, like my siblings. But she was very much an ordinary person. But of course, we all understood that there was something extraordinary about her and her presence. And I also learned at a very young age, as did my mother, that Dorothy did not belong to us. She belonged to the world, and that certainly had its effect on us in terms of her availability to us. And for my mother was 7 years old when Dorothy met Peter, and the Catholic worker movement started in 1933. And Tamar lost her mother to the work. Her mother was a single working mother, and it was very hard on both of them. They were separated from each other for long periods of time, frequently, and they both experienced physical illness from that separation and from the stresses of that early life of getting the Catholic worker movement off the ground. So it certainly is a story of sweetness and sadness for all of us, that history. I think since we are an educational institution, it's very important for me to review some of the basic tenets of the Catholic worker philosophy. And I have what is called the plan of action for Peter's program. Peter was a French peasant. He was one of 22 children, or 20 children, I'm forgetting the number. And he was also trained in the Christian Brothers School. He was an incredible teacher. He had a very thick French accent. My mother talked about his last years. He died in 1949. My mother and father were married in 1944 on the Easton farm. And Tamar remembers spending Peter's last 2 years with him, he did have a stroke. He became quite inarticulate, which was a great sadness for him because he was such a talker. But she did say that it was hard to get a word in edgewise with Peter. But here we have 4 very important tenets of the program. Dorothy knew nothing about Catholic social teaching. Dorothy knew very little. As an adult convert, she had very little training and background in Catholicism. So Peter took her in hand and talked to her about the Catholic social teachings. But the points of his program included the first point being the publication of a paper. And Dorothy was a journalist, and for her this was right up her alley, to be a journalist and to have your own paper. She did have the experiences of working for many of the communist papers as a young woman. But here was the opportunity to have your own publication. And so the purpose of this paper was to reach the people on the street, to educate them on the position of decentralization, meaning we come away from big government and we come away from relying on state charity and developing more local economies and systems. The paper was also important to report on the new encyclicals as they came out from the Pope and other items that the Pope was commenting on in their times, and to share the lives and the inspiration of the saints. The Catholic Worker paper was unique in its illustrations. They had some wonderful artists over the years. Fritz Eichenberg, Ade Bethune, and Rita Corbin were some of the best illustrators of the paper. And Ade Bethune presented pictures of the saints doing everyday activities, sweeping the floor, washing the dishes, canning the fruit, feeding the chickens. And so the paper was graced with some very beautiful illustrations down through the decades, and it still is. We still draw upon those same artists. The paper was also important to give emphasis on the ideas for improvement of the social order. That was Peter's propaganda machine. We do call the paper the organ of the movement. It's still in print. We print 7 times a year. There are copies over on the sideboard there. The most recent issue, October-November issue of the paper, and we continue to try to address the issues of the day in terms of the condition of the worker, in terms of the condition of foreign countries that have experienced our war-making. And also another very important component of the paper is to instruct the Catholics and the laity on the social teachings of the Catholic Church. The second point were, of course, roundtable discussions, the clarification of thought. And this was most important for the building up and education of a lay apostolate. We continue to have Friday night meetings at most of the worker houses. There are over 200 communities around the country, around the world. And Friday night meetings with speakers who come in, very, very important. We also continue to participate and practice leafleting, holding vigils, fasting, and all of this effort is done in terms of trying to support clear thinking in order to be prepared for direct lay Catholic action. So we must have clarification of thought. We must have theory before we're ready to take action. The third point that we would make is, of course, to found the houses of hospitality. And this is what my biggest experience has been living and working at Mary House, Catholic Worker. And we are hoping to open a house in Scranton. So inquire with Phil or Sister John or Father Bill regarding what those efforts might look like in your city, in your community. And the purpose of these houses of hospitality are to practice the corporal works of mercy. And let's remember the corporal works of mercy comes from Matthew 25. We're called to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit the prisoner, visit the sick, and bury the dead. The houses of hospitality give us the opportunity to do this, and to do it as a daily, personal sacrifice. Peter was very clear in terms of practicing the works of mercy as laity to the church at a personal cost. We take direct action, and we meet the desperate and immediate needs of those who we find in dire straits. And the fourth point for us to remember with the Catholic worker history and the movement is the establishment of farming communes. Peter called them Agronomic Universities, and he looked at this, being a farmer, coming from many generations of men on the land. He understood the importance of our connection to the land, our connection to growing our food. And he looked at it also not only as an opportunity to be practical and to gain functional skills, or even to retain the knowledge and understanding of how we raise food. It was also a chance to take proper care of the soil, which he considered nearly to be a sacrament, and to produce the food that is needed to feed the soup lines, the soup kitchens in the cities. So it was a very holistic approach. Another very important component of this was to provide an opportunity for scholars to become workers and workers to become scholars. He thought that the intellectual class had a very serious responsibility to bring along and to share their knowledge and to improve the conditions of the underclass. And so what good way to shake up the class system but to switch roles as much as possible. Have the scholars go and get their hands in the dirt. Have the workers have an opportunity to participate in clarification of thought. And he also talked about the importance of working the land for the restoration of property and the resisting of the servile state, to build up the family, the original community, the first unit of society. And all of this is certainly supported with Catholic social teaching. I think it's always valuable to review the encyclicals. I am very excited about Pope Francis. It is pretty astounding to have him mention 4 names in front of Congress, and Dorothy Day being one of those names. I would point out that out of 3 of the 4 names mentioned, those 3 practiced Gandhian nonviolence. And I think the very important message that the Pope is trying to bring us in the United States is one of peacemaking, the importance and the crucial need for peacemaking in our times. And I know that Cardinal Dolan had his heart set on the Pope mentioning Dorothy because he's very excited about furthering the cause for Dorothy. And so I think the big surprise, I was surprised certainly, but the very big surprise was how he presented her name and in front of the audience that he did present to. So we're very happy about this Pope. And I would also recommend that you look at the biography written about George Mario Bergoglio in his years in Argentina. It's called The Great Reformer by Austin Ivory. And that will help you gain a sense of who our Pope is, who Pope Francis is, his background, his experience. I think that his experience in Argentina of dealing with the dirty war, a fascist dictatorship that disappeared people, a very violent dictatorship, formed him in a very important way. And also in 2001, 2002, I believe it was, Argentina experienced an economic collapse. They refused to go along with the IMF austerity plans. And he was the bishop at that point in time. And he played a very key role in organizing the church itself to take care of the people. Unemployment skyrocketed, inflation skyrocketed, people couldn't feed themselves. And he worked with over 2,000 organizations, other entities, other churches, other faith-based groups, to literally do the work of the moment, which was to feed the unemployed people and their families. And so he understood what needed to be done in a time of crisis. So I'm very pleased with what I've seen since March of 2013. And I did take the opportunity to send him a copy of The Long Loneliness, translated into the Italian. And so he does know about Dorothy. He's been getting educated, and Cardinal Dolan did send him many copies to share with others of a book called All is Grace by Jim Forrest, which was recently updated with the inclusion of Dorothy's letters and journals that you can also look up. The Duty of Delight and All the Way to Heaven are two other recent volumes, very important writings of Dorothy's. It gives you insight into her everyday life and what she was up against, both within her own community and with the cardinals of New York that she dealt with in her lifetime. I just want to include some very important points that jumped out at me regarding the content of Pope Francis's congressional speech. And he's certainly giving us a roadmap in terms of how we are to proceed in this time of great upheaval and crisis. Building a future of freedom requires love of the common good and cooperation in a spirit of subsidiarity and solidarity. And certainly Peter and Dorothy understood this and outlined it in their program of voluntary poverty, working in houses of hospitality, and practicing personalism at a cost, and implementing the Catholic social teachings. We must be especially attentive to every type of fundamentalism, whether religious or of any other kind. And I think here we're getting a little inkling of what he's alluding to in terms of what we're facing, not only with regards to what's happening in the Middle East with a decade later after the complete destruction of the country of Iraq, and then the vacuum that was created. So we have what's called ISIS, a so-called fundamentalist group. I think he's also talking about fundamentalism in our own homes, in our own families, in our own country. So let's be aware of walking away of having ideology completely trump the reality on the ground. He talks about love and mercy is more important than ideology in terms of meeting the needs, the dire needs of society and the family. Dualistic thinking, right, wrong, good, evil, righteous, sinner. This is the polarization that we're up against, and we face this on a daily basis in our own culture. Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders. I mean, how much further apart can you get with ideals of political solutions? And so we must be aware of that polarization, that the demands on us to take dual positions. You're for me or you're against me. And I think the Pope recognizes many shades of gray in between there. There's a need for a response of hope and healing, peace and justice. You know, to say, who am I to judge? To declare a year of mercy in 2016, to speak in terms of mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. This is the balm that is so desperately needed in our times versus the polarization. Uniting resources and our talents to support each other and to respect differences in our convictions of conscience. And this is within the Christian church itself. Dorothy dreamt about reconciliation of the schism of the church, the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. And I know that Pope Francis has been meeting with the Orthodox Church. So he's telling us we need to make peace with each other, Protestants, Methodists, Orthodox, Roman Catholic. And so what more could we ask for in terms of true leadership from him? Commit to living with dignity and justice for everyone. And again, he gets us back to the very basics. We are all one of another. We are all part of the mystical body. And when one part suffers, we all suffer. And Dorothy clearly understood this in her work and in her conversion. Remember the golden rule, very simple, very simple. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And when you have refugees coming from terrific trauma and danger, you don't put them in detention centers and deport them. You figure out what you can do as Christians to take care of them. He spoke a lot about abolishing the death penalty, and that's certainly something that we need to work more on. He talks about Dorothy in terms of her social activism, her passion for justice, and for the cause of the oppressed. And that is very inspiring for me to hear those words, where he is framing her in a way that we can all understand and try and follow. I love the way he referred to Thomas Merton, a man of prayer who facilitated dialogue, a promoter of peace between religions. And of course, we all know that he died in Thailand, in Asia, where he was reaching out to other religions as a Christian. The Pope also spoke very blatantly and very clearly about the arms trade, both foreign and domestic. We're looking at an industry that is incredibly death-dealing, soaked in money. He talked about innocent blood. The money is soaked in blood, innocent blood. And I think the situation in Syria right now is a fine example of this business of flooding the area with armaments. I can't help but think about the book of Scarlett O'Hara, Gone with the Wind. Remember Rhett Butler? He was running guns to both sides, the North and the South, in the Civil War. And I can't help but think about ISIS is armed with U.S. munitions. So the Pope spoke about this. What are we to do to get this under control? That so much money is being made, so much havoc is being wreaked because of the availability of guns. And of course, domestically, we've got this ongoing discussion about gun control. I did recently read that the Bishop of Chicago, Bishop Kupich, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name properly, he recently spoke out very clearly that yes, we desperately need gun legislation, gun control. And I firmly believe that he's catching courage from what the Pope is sharing with us. And of course, I think what's so beautiful about Pope Francis is that he's a very gentle admonisher. I have to take my cues from him more, so I find myself getting too passionate. But he talks about the richness of our cultural heritage, and he doesn't scold us. He encourages us. He tells us that, you know, we're doing wonderful things, and we can do more. And that's the way to be a good papa, I think. So I'm very, very excited about Laudato Si, about the joy of the gospel. I'm hoping that you all are getting your hands on Laudato Si. I think it's not just for Catholics to be reading, but for everyone to be reading. It's all right there, laid out, where we are heading and what we need to do to turn that around. So I would also like to share with you a little bit of my experiences at Mary House. You know, I was just on the phone with my daughter. She has a 3-year-old, Jacoby. My grandson got on the phone and had to say hello to me. It's a wonderful life in Vermont, and I very much miss it when I'm away. And my family does put pressure on me to be home and to be helping. I find that when I'm at Mary House, I'm doing very much similar things that I do as a mother, as a grandmother, as a wife. I'm cooking, I'm cleaning, I'm serving meals, I'm sitting with others, I'm sharing of myself with others. And at Mary House, we have the soup line 4 days a week. We have between 30 to 70 women who come in. We have 20 to 25 people living in the house, homeless people and volunteers. And sometimes that line gets blurred between whether you're a volunteer or whether you're a guest. I mean, I would just simply say that we all come to the houses of hospitality with needs. And we provide showers, the clothing room, and phone access for the women. We also have our Friday night meetings, roundtable discussions. We have a pool of priests who come in and give Mass 1 day a week at St. Joe's, 1 day a week at Mary House. We have Bible study on Wednesday nights. So we pray Vespers at 7 p.m. in the evenings. We try to maintain a balance of work and prayer, which is very difficult to do in New York City in the 21st century. But Dorothy was an oblate, Benedictine oblate, and their motto, Ora et Labora. We try to emulate that in our communities, both houses. We share cooking for both houses. St. Joe's serves probably 100 to 120 men meals 5 days a week. And the houses, I had mentioned that St. Joe's was purchased in the mid-60s, Mary House in the mid-70s, and the neighborhood has changed drastically since I was a kid. When we went to visit, it was, very much a bombed out situation. And now we have, the Bowery, very, very impoverished, a lot of violence. And now we have the gentrification of Lower Manhattan. It's now considered the East Village. Dorothy landed in Lower East Village, and now it's simply called the East Village. And NYU owns a good portion of the real estate there. There are many, many, many boutiques, bars. The latest thing is the smoking. Smoking has come back with a vengeance, and there are bars where you can go to do vapors. It's very different, and we often look around and say, what are we doing here? What do we belong here? And I firmly believe that Dorothy in a heartbeat would sell the places and move somewhere else. I mean, she started on Mott Street. They had houses on Kenmare Square, Christie Street. So they were driven from pillar to post in the 40s, 50s, and 60s with the urban renewal projects going on. But I think that she would certainly seriously look at, we're not living with the poor. So it is a dilemma for us. People are attached to the house. I'm certainly attached because that's where I went to visit her. The two houses that I've known all of my life. And the room that she lived and died in is a very, very holy place. And the buildings are probably worth millions as teardowns. Mary House is an old school, music school, and it was built in the late 1800s, and it's not in good condition. And it would probably be torn down. So that is something that we face. We have to sit down and really think about our future there in the city. I think there's also the consideration of, do we stay amidst the heart of affluence where rents have gone from $800 to $5,000 a month? Do we stay there as a witness and remain a thorn in the side of the upper class? I don't know. I mean, it's just something that we have to discern as we go. And with the canonization process, that changes things as well. There's a church on 2nd Avenue called Nativity, and that is where Dorothy went to church. In her last years, it was harder and harder for her to get up and down the stairs and to walk to Mass, which she tried to do on a daily basis. And Nativity, we had her funeral there in 1980, and it has been closed down just 2 months ago. And the real estate market is just booming in this area. And now we have Nativity with its doors closed and homeless people camping out on the steps. And it's just such a sight to walk past and to see the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus gone, the window empty, and people sleeping and building cardboard houses in front of that. I mean, the symbolism of what's happening in the city is right there in our faces. So those are some of the things that we're coping with in the city. I do have to say that working on the soup line, working in the house, living with those you have not chosen to put up with, to create a house with. I mean, there's a lot of mental illness with homelessness. And so I find myself coming up against myself, living and working in a house of hospitality where I'm challenged every day in my attitudes towards my housemates, my attitudes towards the women who come in, who bang on the door and say, I need a coat, and you may find the coat in the trash 2 blocks away. You can't predict how things end up. And, the tendency, the desire, the inclination to judge people is always on the tip of my tongue. And so I find it to be quite a humbling experience to put myself in that position of doing this work and being nice about it, and tolerating difficulty, and tolerating chaos, and tolerating lack of cleanliness, lack of order. And so I would encourage you all to go visit these communities now that I've painted a grim picture of them. There's joy, there's such joy, and there's such love in these houses. It's beyond compare. So I just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you. To give you a sense of the work today, I have traveled to foreign places. I've recently had a trip to Kabul, Afghanistan in June, and I am working with a group called Afghan Peace Volunteers. And these are young men. I traveled with a woman named Kathy Kelly, who is out of Chicago with a group called Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She worked in the 1990s bringing food and medical supplies into Iraq during the sanctions. Hundreds of thousands of children died with those sanctions. And so Kathy was focused on Iraq at that time. Now she has switched her focus on Afghanistan. And the people there have faced war for at least 40 years. So the Afghan Peace Volunteers they're young men now, but the person who helped organize them is a man named Hakim, who is actually a medical doctor. He went to the refugee camps on the border of Pakistan and met these children and their families, and now that was over a decade ago. So now they've grown up. And they come from different ethnic backgrounds: Hazara, Tajik, Uzbek, Pashtun. And they're learning how to live together. They're learning how to cook and clean for one another, just like what we do in the houses of hospitality. And the 2 projects that they're working on right now are a school for children who have to work in the streets and not go to school so that they can feed their families. And the poverty, the destitution, the violence is horrendous. And Kabul was designed to hold, I think, 5 million people, and now that number has more than doubled, with refugees, internally displaced peoples coming into Kabul as a result of the U.S. Bombing of the outer provinces. And the second project that they're addressing is the making of duvets or coverlets. Many, many children are in the refugee camps, and many die in the wintertime of freezing to death. There's not enough food. And so the mothers in the neighborhood were coming to the Afghan Peace Volunteers and saying, we're desperate, we can't feed our families, we feel like we're losing our minds. The trauma, everyone is experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Everyone has experienced seeing the murder of a family member before their very eyes. And so these mothers were saying, please, what can we do? And so the duvet project was launched, and the women are paid to make these duvets, and then they're given away through these local schools and mosques and at the refugee camps to help families who are in great need. So for me, going to these places, it's difficult, it's scary, it's not easy. The first time, I've been there 3 times. The first time I landed there, I just had no idea what to expect. And the 3rd time in June, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay with these incredible people who were building community together. And they are being instructed by Noam Chomsky, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. in terms of living in a way of nonviolence. And so I'm very grateful to be able to have that experience of traveling to Kabul. We also had a chance to visit one of the hospitals there, Emergency, which is actually an Italian project. And they have been in Kabul for, I think, at least a decade now. and they provide medical care for everyone from all sides. They don't discriminate, and no weapons are allowed into the hospital, and it's a miracle how it works. And we just recently experienced this business of the bombing of a hospital, the Doctors Without Borders, where doctors and nurses were killed. And the story, as it was unfolding, just seemed to change. Oh, it was an accident, to we didn't mean to do it, and now evidence is coming out that it was intentional. And what has happened that we are blatantly able to defy Geneva Conventions and international law and be killing doctors in hospitals? This hospital was so desperately needed in this area to treat people. And we heard from our friends about getting that news and the impact that it had on them psychologically to know that the hospital was bombed on purpose. And where are the repercussions for that? So this is what I get to hear when I am trying to practice what we call the works of mercy. And part of that is to visit the prisoner and to love the enemy, to meet the enemy. And that's what I'm trying to accomplish by going to these places and participating. And what I find are people and families just like our own, desperately trying to take care of their children, to get their children educated, to make sure that they have adequate nutrition. Many of the children in Afghanistan are malnourished. So sometimes this work can feel absolutely overwhelming. And I find myself resorting to, and I have not been to a place where U.S. bombing was occurring. I do have friends. We have folks living at Mary House who were in Baghdad during shock and awe. And I have not had that experience. The closest that I've had to that was at Rafah border in Egypt. We were trying to get into Gaza Strip, and we heard the bombs dropping there. But that's the closest that I've heard. And my friend Kathy Kelly said that her hair turned white overnight with that experience of sitting in Baghdad in 2003 with the bombing of that city, the utter destruction of that culture. I hate to go on and on about, these grim topics. The other things that we've been getting involved with is a group called Witness Against Torture, which came out of the Mary House Catholic Worker. And we've been involved with that since 2007, where we're protesting Guantanamo Bay prison camp. There are folks there who have been held for over a decade without charges. And so we have committed ourselves to this practice of fasting. We fasted anywhere from 3 days to 12 days. Each year we go down in January and we fast and we pray and we vigil and we stand in jumpsuits with hoods over our heads. It's very intense work. I mean, I feel like a fanatic. I feel like a fool doing this kind of work. But to be under the hood in front of the public with people passing by saying, didn't they close down Guantanamo already? And the fact of the matter is that it's not closed down. So that's an issue. We've been into courtrooms, we've been into jails over that issue of Guantanamo, indefinite detention, extraordinary rendition, and torture, all violating Geneva Convention and international law. And of course the other topic is drones, the use of drones for targeted assassinations, and President Obama has been using that program at much greater rates than President Bush did. So those are the issues that we're currently involved with, and I would encourage you to read and to learn and to understand what is being done in our names with our tax dollars in order to maintain our standard of living. Our standard of living, which is the highest in the history of humankind, comes at a tremendous cost to the majority of the rest of the world's population. And this is what I learn when I go to these places. I'll end with a quote from Dorothy. This was something that she wrote in 1946. She's witnessing World War II. She's trying desperately to keep the movement alive during World War II. The circulation of the paper plummeted. Half of the houses of hospitality closed because she took a stand of saying there is no such thing as just war in modern warfare because of aerial bombardment, because of the numbers of civilian casualties versus military casualties just flipped with the technology of modern warfare. So she spoke about World War II not being just. And she took a great hit for that because the argument was, how do you stop Hitler? So this is something she wrote in 1946. We feel that the great causes of wars are maldistribution, not only of goods but also of populations. Peter used to talk about a philosophy of work and a philosophy of poverty. Both are needed in order to change things as they are, to do away with the causes of war. The bravery to face voluntary poverty is needed if we wish to marry, if we wish to live, to have children, to raise our families, to produce children, and to work for life instead of working for death, and to reject war. Thank you. I would like to open it up to question and answer at this point in time. Yes,
What we're
please.
starting to start, we're going to circulate some materials that Mrs. Hennessy has provided, so if you would just make sure that you do get those before you leave.
Thank you. That's true. Can you stand up and speak loudly? Sorry.
Okay, did your father die early?
My father died at the age of 92 in 2005. He was born and died the same year as Rosa Parks. But he left the family and left the Catholic worker in the early 1960s.
And if I could just interrupt for a second, we're grateful for so many of you students who have come. And again, if you would take the bibliography and the prayer card, your professor will be sure you were here, just in case you cannot make sense of your notes. I would like to encourage you to stay for the questions. You will see that Mrs. Hennessy is actually a person of great humor and wisdom, not just as all of this macabre evil that she has faced, perhaps because of it. But if you need to get somewhere or just want to leave at this point, this is a guilt-free opportunity for the students to get up and leave, as long as you grab a bibliography on your way out. And again, we're sincerely grateful that you did make the effort to be here tonight. And for those who are remaining, if you would like to move closer, feel free, but otherwise we'll just give them a few seconds to clear the room and we'll continue with questions. You did get a commitment.
Thank you, yes. Thank you. Yes?
Do you have very many young people working with you at Mary House and the other?
Mary House and St. Joe's, we have a shortage of young people. I think that there are other communities around the country that do have better numbers. We do have Notre Dame students who come for the summer and do internships. We do have students coming to work on a daily basis, not necessarily to live in the houses. I think that the young people today are faced with much more stressors and debt. The pressure to come out of school and to earn a living, I think, are much greater. I think in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of young people had the flexibility to come and spend a year, either between high school and college or right after college. But I know that there are other communities who do seem to have better help that way, what with their local colleges. And we need to improve on that. But we do have young folks coming and going. But we need more. We desperately need more. Yes?
Martha, when you were talking about perhaps if Dorothy were alive, she would want to sell the property because the land is worth so tremendously much under it. and so much good could be done.
She wouldn't want to sell it because of its value.
No, because it's a gentrified neighborhood.
She would want to get out of the neighborhood.
Yes. However, as you were saying, the other side of that is being a witness there.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't part of the idea of comforting the afflicted, but afflicting the comfortable?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, therefore, people who can pay $5,000 a month
Mhm.
rent in an area where the rent
Yeah.
used to be under 800,
Mm-hmm.
need to be able to
Yeah.
be confronted daily with the fact that most of humanity can't do that.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. At St. Joe's, the soup line is outside the door because the kitchen is very small and people do have to see the poor. I had a thought as you were speaking earlier about, how do you afflict the comfortable in a way that, is effective and is nonviolent? The situation with nativity, we have petitioned the Archdiocese to allow the community, the parish, which was actually growing, to actually do something with the building that serves the poor in the neighborhood. So the presence of the Catholic worker and of Dorothy's story and history would stay alive and well in the neighborhood through the use of the rectory for showers. There was a place on Bleecker Street called Holy Name that provided mailboxes and showers for homeless men from way early on, I think beginning in the 1940s, and it was shut down very recently, the opposite of what Pope Francis is telling us to do, and it was turned into the Sheen Center, which is a beautiful, lovely center. It's a Catholic culture center, and it has 2 theaters, and they're doing wonderful things. But there are no longer showers for men in the neighborhood. And so we're really hoping to reopen something like that for the homeless in Nativity. And to have social services, we have a woman in the parish who is a certified social worker, and she's very happy to donate her time to help people access services. We would love to have a little shrine there, an educational center, a meditation center, that Dorothy's presence could be retained and felt. So we are living with such contradiction in terms of, on the one hand, we want to canonize her, and on the other hand, we're shutting down the church that she attended. So I don't know what the future is for any of us in that neighborhood. But we're still there. It's not easy to keep the place running.
What's your group's relationship with Cardinal Dolan?
He visited us when he was bishop, before he was made cardinal. He did come to Mary House, which was a wonderful thing. He did come with someone who had a gun on him, but they wouldn't confess that. So, I'm part of the Dorothy Day Guild here. George Horton is the director of the Guild, and he works out of the offices at the Archdiocese. So I have a very good working relationship with him. And Monsignor Mustaciello is the one who is the postulator for her cause. And, we're certainly in touch with him through the Guild. But Cardinal Dolan is not that available to us. We invited the Pope to come visit us, but that didn't happen. I mean, the billions was spent, millions, I don't know how much was spent in securing his presence in the city. So it's just a very different world that the Cardinal is in. We do our best to get along. Yes?
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting. I'd like to push you on something if I could. The process of discernment, knowing that the Catholic worker doesn't have a chief,
Yes.
et cetera, et cetera. The process of discernment that you're going through over those 2 houses, and where you see that process of discernment going.
I don't think we've even started the process.
You haven't.
I think we procrastinate. Some of us may be thinking, what are the different scenarios? You know, and what role could the archdiocese play in that as well, of taking over the buildings and opening another house in a more impoverished neighborhood? There are many possibilities, great possibilities. And so we no longer have our charismatic leader. We must work together. I mean, this is what the world faces today. We don't have strong leaders. And we need to work things out as a committee. And that's not easy to do. I mean, we're all anarchists. We're all going in our own directions in a certain sense, but we're all there together to work together. And we do have this shared vision. But decision-making is not easy. But there are folks who have been with the community over 20 years, you know, very, very long-standing members. And I have trust that things will be what they need to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a number of people who have been coming to Catholic Workhouse over the years, the street people that are regulars over time, or do you have a transitional period of new people coming in?
Oh, we have women who we see for years. We have very special relationships with them.
And that's a reason to
Yeah.
want to be.
Yes, it's a complex network of community members. We also have people living in the neighborhoods who are in these rent-stabilized apartments because they've been there for 30 years. People who worked with Dorothy and who, you know, continue to volunteer at the houses and who continue to share dinner with us. So there's a lot to be taken into consideration of who gets affected by any of these decisions. Because it's a community of live-ins and neighbors. Go ahead, sister.
Oh, you're speaking about Mary House and Joseph House. What knowledge do you have about other houses in the United States that, like, what are their longevity, so to speak, as far
Yes.
as, because they're each separate, they each have their own history, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
and their own discernment process
Mhm.
about their house. Let's say of the 200 houses that were formed, what percentage of those houses are still in existence?
Some of them are quite young. We have Viva House in Baltimore with Willa and Brendan, and they established their house before Dorothy died. She visited them. This was the early 70s. Many of these communities are coming up on 20th, 30th, 40th anniversaries. The LA Catholic Worker, the Des Moines Catholic Worker, Houston, Casa Juan Diego, they have been at it since the 1980s. So the longevity of some of these communities is quite impressive. But it does rely on a couple who run the house, who are the heads of the house. And they're aging.
And what happens then to those?
Very good question. I mean, we have the Rochester St. Joe's house where Peter Marn, it's the longest standing community. Peter Marn visited that very building in the 40s. And we're not sure, we don't know. It's not clear that we have young people stepping in to be ready to take over as others age out. So it's a question. Yes?
For you personally, was there a sort of pivotal point where you really wanted to go out and follow what Dorothy did or do what she said, sort of thing, be an activist? Or was that feeling just always sort of?
Thank you. A very good question. You know, what was the impetus there? I mean, I grew up very cognizant of the fact of social justice and oppression. and understanding the suffering, being willing to look at the suffering of others. And so I understood Dorothy's life and work within the context of social justice issues. It wasn't until I returned to the Catholic Church, I was out of the Catholic Church after my father left the family. My mother sort of drifted away from the church. And as a young adult, I had a difficult time understanding Dorothy's faith, her piety, her religiosity, as a foundation for the social justice work. And so it took me a good 30 years to bring all of that together, despite the fact that I was involved politically with, protesting nuclear power, protesting nuclear weapons. But it was, re-entering the Catholic Church had to happen before I could re-enter the Catholic worker. And my kids had to grow up and get out the door too, as well. So it's hard to explain. Dorothy was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2001. That induction ceremony was postponed because of 9/11. And so in 2002, the ceremony actually occurred. There were 19 inductees. And the family was asked to please come and receive this award. And my mother certainly couldn't do it. She was quite frail and quite shy. No one else in the family was going to do it. And I would say probably in 2002, making that decision to take responsibility to write a 3-minute speech and show up and give it had a profound impact on me. And we were about to declare war on Iraq. This was October of 2002. We invaded in March of 2003. The drumbeat to war was happening. And so I clearly stated in my talk, we were about to unleash overwhelming force against this tiny country. And what would Dorothy have to say about this? And it instantaneously polarized the audience. I mean, there were many people there are in the military. There's the Army Weapons Depot Center near Seneca Falls, New York. And so, in a flash, I was so nervous, I was so unsure, I had to do this, I forced myself to do it. And in a flash, I recognized the seriousness of getting involved personally. And where am I going to put myself in this? I was comfortable in my lovely home with my family, going to work and earning a paycheck and maintaining a professional license, and I had to really reassess what my role would be. I spent 25 years, 30 years avoiding getting involved. I was raising my family also, but God was preparing me for this transition. And so 2004 was another very pivotal moment for me. I did not step foot in the house, into Mary House, for 24 years after Granny's funeral. And I can't exactly explain myself in terms of returning to the house. But there were events that occurred in 2004 that firmly established me back into my baptism. And conversions are mysterious things. And I'm slowly beginning to understand, you don't have this foundation, you don't do this work of social justice and houses of hospitality without a very firm grounding in a prayer life, in faith-based, studying the scriptures, praying daily. Dorothy would forever be in supplication. Please help me to do this work. Help me to get through this day. Help me to write this article. It continues. Yes?
Did you feel guided by her story in the story that you just told us?
Did I feel guided by her story?
Yeah, the grandmother's story.
Well, yes, that was my only reference point, really. The stories, my mother's life, my grandmother's life, the family stories, the family experiences. It was very firmly embedded in my psyche. And until I came back into my faith, I couldn't understand well enough what it was that drove her and sustained her. And so, yes, and then I started reading her books more seriously. My mother said, I can't read her writings. It was too close for her, somehow. It's hard to understand. But reading Dorothy was certainly, reading The Duty of Delight, the diaries, from 1930 to 1980. It's the story of my family's life. I would sit there and weep. My grandparents separating, the letters my grandmother wrote to my grandfather. And so, it's certainly, I've had to work very hard to get comfortable with the fact that you walk into a house and there's a picture of your grandmother on the kitchen wall. What does that mean? What does that mean to the world? Where does that place me in this scheme? And it's been very difficult. And my siblings certainly are not comfortable. They're not practicing Catholics themselves, but they're not comfortable trying to grapple with this legacy. Yes.
You mentioned last night that you think your mother was every bit as holy as your grandmother. Could you just comment on that a little bit?
Well, Tamar was raised Catholic. Dorothy was not. It's a big difference there, to come to the faith as an adult convert. Tamar, experienced mean nuns. She experienced, she was incredibly bright. A priest told Dorothy that she was slow. That impacted her education tremendously. Tamar herself, in her education, she said that there were two major red flags that popped up at her as a child. And one was when she was told that babies would live in limbo forever if they died before baptism. She thought, there's something wrong with this picture. Just her humanity told her that didn't sit well with her. And the other aspect was the disrespect or the lack of coverage of the sciences. My grandfather was a biologist. My grandfather was a naturalist. He loved and understood the natural world. And Tamar was much more like her father than she was like her mother. And so when science got short shrift in her Catholic education, that was another red flag for her. So she was raised Catholic. She retained the best of the Catholic teachings, but she could not abide by the corruption of the institution and the treatment of women and children. And so she still managed to remain a person of loving kindness, a person of forgiveness, a person of guidance. She died in 2008, and there were over a dozen people there at the funeral that talked about how she saved them and their lives when they were teenagers. And Dorothy gave her the highest compliment by saying, you have a very good house of hospitality yourself here. We took in the neighbors' kids. When we came back from the Tivoli farm, Catholic worker farm, runaways would come home with us and grow up, finish growing up with us. And so Tamar practiced all of those principles of the Catholic worker movement. And, there is certainly something incredible and divine and miraculous in her conception and birth, and the impact that had on Dorothy and her conversion. And my mother did all kinds of things before it was vogue. She was making tofu in the 1970s. She taught me how to spin and weave and knit. She was an alchemist. She used vegetable dyes to dye the wool that we were spinning. She did all kinds of things. She was a very hands-on, talented person, and she had great instinct for growing things. Wonderful, wonderful green thumb. So, and she, did not live up to the expectations of her own mother in certain ways. And so she kind of became invisible. And moving to Vermont in 1957 was like moving to Siberia. And so she doesn't get as much credit as I think she deserves. But my youngest sister, Kate, who I believe has the gift of writing, as her grandmother did, has written a book. It will be published by Scribner. Her goal in writing this book was to give Tamar a voice. And I think she does this beautifully. So wait for that to understand more about what Tamar went through.
How do you think Dorothy would have felt about being called a saint?
I'm sorry?
How do you think Dorothy would have felt about being called a saint?
I know. I hope Robert Ellsberg talked about this with this thing, don't call me a saint. I like to think that now that she's in heaven, she's all for it. I think, the obvious objections are, get out there and do the work yourselves. Don't, say, oh, it's only saints and it's only special people who can do this. I think that's one point. And of course, the other point being that it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and why are we spending money that way? She would certainly object to that. But we need our saints. We desperately need our saints. And I think that she is clearly a fine example of a 20th century saint. Being a woman, being an ordinary woman, being a mother, living the life that she lived, the ups and downs. I think she's a great saint, a great model for women, for young women especially. So I think that argument is used in a way that's not quite fair about her. She herself was saying, don't make me a saint. Don't put me on a pedestal. Don't dismiss me that easily. I think having her words more widely read would just be the best thing in the world for the church. I think that she can revive the church in a way that's just unmeasurable. So I'm for it. It took me a long time. I have my doubts about how they're going to handle her, how they're going to portray her, but I have faith that her words are there and will come through. So I'm on the guild. Yes.
Did Dorothy have any close contact with Gandhi, his writings, or was she influenced by him in any way? Did you ever...
Yes, we would have to go back through the archives and see what she was saying in the 1940s. I remember reading something where she was calling him a pagan because he wasn't Christian. But then, in the same breath, she was saying that he understood Jesus much better than many Christians did. So yes, he was a great inspiration to her. She was very astutely aware of Gandhi's life, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. I mean, she was always reading, always staying in touch with what was happening in her times. I don't know that they ever corresponded.
I'm reluctant to call a halt. Mrs. Hennessy has been so generous with her time and energy.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
You all have been very generous.